Moving on from the suspension now takes us to the most difficult and hardest part on this entire build to do. And if you think that I'm referring to swapping out the M4 Sherman turret with the Pershing turret, you would actually be incorrect. The hardest part, most noteworthy conversion that was required was actually that of the rear hull area. Literally just about the entire heavy work required on this model here was focused on the rear hull area. And the conversion really took up the majority of the time for this build. Like what was mentioned in the unboxing portion of the video, the Sherman variant that is supplied with the Heng Long model is that of an M4A3 105. The actual Sherming hybrid, or the M4 90mm, is that the base vehicle which was used for the lower hull was that of an M4 105. The M4 105 utilized a different rear hull configuration compared to that of the M4A3. The M4 utilized the radial engine, while the M4A3 utilized the 4 GAA. The difference being is that the engine decks were completely different. Rather than the two large grille areas which are found on the A3, the M4 had an air intake in an armored cover located here right after the turret, a large hatch plate which is very similar to the M4A4, as well as specifically for the many of the 105 versions there is an extra filler cap located on the plate here in the back. In addition to the glaring difference being that of the engine deck, the other differences that needed to have been addressed is that of the actual rear hull angle. As you can see on this version here of the Sherman, the hull angle is more vertical compared to the angled version which is found on the M4A3. In order to replace this engine deck, the back also needed to have been reshaped, and if you only do one and not the other, you're going to be incorrect. In addition to the rear plate being a different angle, the entire rear upper portion of the tank is also substantially different compared to that of the M4A3. Starting with the upper hull, you'll notice that it does not have that dip down that is found on the A3 variant, which is found with the stock Heng Long model. Also, you will see that on the entire rear wall, detailing also had to have been replaced, and all of the details which were supplied with the Heng Long were all pitched. Before I talk more about the engine deck, let's go ahead and talk about the lower hull. This was one portion, like I said, was heavily modified from the stock original offering. The components which were used from Heng Long was that of the tow hitch and tow hitch mount. These were kept, as well as the towing eyes which are in the back. These were also kept, however they were drilled out to replicate the real tow eyes on the Sherman. Simple procedure that you could do to any of these Heng Longs to improve the look. As for the idler mounts, these are again the Heng Longs, however they do feature the EastCoastArmory.com rear idler detail inserts, which are more detailed compared to the stock Heng Long offerings. Where the back begins to change is above this portion here. As you can see, the small little hatch which is found on the rear engine plate of the A3 was swapped out with the double door version, which is for that of the radial engine. This set here is a new addition from EastCoastArmory.com. It is a resin set which contains that of the two doors as well as the handles and smaller other fittings. Moving from the hatches takes us to the air filters. The air filters that you see here are the ones that are found on Shapeways and are 3D printed. Their information is found in the video description below, as well as even below in this video link. What was added to the Shapeway components, as the pieces were very nicely done, however the Shapeway components are missing the actual fasteners and straps which are found on the real units. The Shapeway component does have all of the fittings where these pieces do get mounted on, however. To go ahead and complete the detailing on the Shapeway pieces, I simply added the fastener detailing and strap detailing which were added to the mounts which were found on the 3D printed versions. The little wing nuts you see here were probably the trickiest part to fabricate, and were actually made out of small pieces of wire that were bent and flattened to the shape of wing nuts. Now, to mount the air filters to the tank, I also had to build up the side hull areas of the rear hull. The stock Heng Long kit, the hull literally stops short right aft of the rear wall, and so the sponson detailing is absent and was fabricated, as well as these two support pieces that we have here on either side. On the real Sherman tank, the air filters are actually mounted to the support features, which are found on the real tank and have to be there. Both the sponsons as well as the straps you see here are all fabricated out of sheet Lexan, which was mounted to the Heng Long body. The entire lower hull is one piece, and the pieces are not connected to the upper, and it just sits right on top of it. Also on the bottom, you can see here I added the ECA axis caps, which are found on the bottom portion of the sponson, and it's a mirror image on the opposite side as well. Moving away from the sponsons and the air filters takes us to the last conversion required on the lower to make it in spec with an M4, and that is of the exhaust manifolds. Now, the exhaust manifolds on the M4 differ from that of the A3 in that the A3 has the two large goosenecking exhausts which emerge from the lower hull. With the M4, the exhaust manifold emerges from the radial and protrudes from the top portion of the hull here, directly over the engine hatch. The manifolds you see here are a new addition to the EastCoastArmory.com product line, and for the mounting on the model are mounted directly onto the smoke generator, and then they simply protrude from the portion where they need to be. Now, in order to do that, I had to amputate a section of plastic which was found on the lower hull rear plate. This section was deleted, and in its place I added the mesh work as well as the frame work required to hold the mesh. This is also detailing found on the real M4 Sherman, and you need to have this detailing in order to complete the conversion. Moving up to the upper rear plate takes us to the rear wall. Like I said before, the piece that emerges from the rear wall on the A3 that on the Heng Long unit holds the large deflector grill, that was completely amputated and was not needed and was deleted. As for the rear wall detailing, that is all basic from the Heng Long kit, as this version of the Sherman did contain these components. We have the typical track racks. They are the Heng Long versions. The only mod that I made was I added a small little wing nut detailing, which is found that on the real Sherman is what holds the straps in place in order to prevent the spare track links from falling out. You loosen the wing nut, these open up, and you can remove the links. As for the rear rack, this is also the Heng Long unit and was left stock as is. The only modification that I did make was actually to the gun cleaning staves. The modification that was made to the staves was really in this area here. The rest of the staves are basically kit. All of that was done was I painted the wooden handles and added their wood treatment to them. As for the end here, on the real Sherman tank, this here is the swab portion of the staves, which are used to clean the barrel and keep it maintained. Now, on the kit, it does have this stave molded in. However, the swab is nothing more than a little peg with a knob on the end. To improve the accuracy further on the kit, I went ahead and replaced the stock peg with an actual piece of small pipe cleaner. The pipe cleaner in this scale really replicates the look of the real unit. What was recycled from the stock version was that of the end cap, which is found on the real staves, and was once it added to the piece really helps the piece to the next level. Moving up to the actual engine deck now. The engine deck, like I said before, is a spare engine deck from a Tamiya M4A3 that I converted for a commission build to an M50 Israeli Sherman. The component itself was nicely detailed, and I had to go ahead and mount it directly to the deck of the Heng Long. To do that with the Multimaster, I went ahead and amputated the exact section of rear deck that this component here was going to replace. Here I have the original engine deck, and you can see how the piece was amputated and replaced. Once the rear deck was fused to the top upper hull, the rest of the work was to replace the missing components which are found on this deck, namely that of the interior. The rear deck portion of the Heng Long Sherman is important in that it not only acts as the column supports which mount the upper hull to the lower hull, but it's also the component where you find the mounts required for the turret rotating gearbox. In order to replace these pieces, what I went ahead and did was I literally just amputated the parts which were integrally molded to the rear portion here. I carefully removed them and then mounted them in the exact same locations on the new rear deck. Now this is one location where the measurements have to be very, very precise, as if you're off, the upper deck will not mate to the lower deck, and also the gearbox will not mesh properly with that of the turret, leaving for a bunch of issues. On the exterior portion of the detailing for the engine deck, I went ahead and replaced some of the molded-in detailing from Tamiya, namely that of the grab handles, which were replaced with real wire handles, as well as the small little hex head fasteners, which are found on this portion here. These were found on the Tamiya unit. However, during the bodywork portion of the build where I was mating and fusing everything together, the stock fasteners were lost, and I replaced them with wire brad detailing in the same location which the molded-in ones were found in. Also, another bit of detailing that I added was that of the armored cover. The cast texturing, which is found on this component, was added. Also, as a quick side note, like what was mentioned in the unboxing portion of the video, there was a huge hump found in the back portion of the grillwork, and the grillwork seemed to be deformed. Once the model was disassembled during the construction, I found out the true reason for that. As you can see, here goes the stock engine deck here, and it is perfectly flat. As we've seen from the other portion of the video, it did have this weird hump to it like this. The reason for that is because of this channel here. This channel here is designed to lock into the rear wall of the lower hull and keep everything in place. Well, maybe it's this batch of Shermans from China, but what happened was whoever was building this tank in the factory went ahead and misconstrued this channel as a channel for that of a guide wire for that of the taillights. When that person did that, as you can see, he put the wire in place and hot glued it. When that was done, when it came time to install the upper deck, it made contact against the rear hull and caused it to blister upward like that. It's a very simple thing to fix if anyone does have one of these models and is getting tired of looking at the big ugly hump in the back. You simply either remove the wires from here and remove the hot glue, or you could simply just cut away that section of the rear wall that makes contact with the upper deck, which will both correct the hump situation. But it's another thing to keep aware of, and it's something that is not going to ruin your model if you do get one and you see it with that hump. Moving on from the rear deck takes us to the upper hull detailing, starting with the tank's rear taillights. The rear taillights, which are found on the Heng Long kit, are very soft in detailing and can be improved. For the units you see here, I replaced the Heng Long versions with 3D printed USAFV taillights from Shapeways. The link is found again in the video description and below. Now, one caveat is that the versions found on Shapeways are for post-World War II pattern vehicles, namely that for the Walker Bulldog. However, the difference between the post-war and the World War II version of the USAFV taillights is that the post-war version has a few little fastener star nubs which are mounted around the exterior portion of the taillight. To convert the post-war taillight to the World War II taillight, I simply just sanded away and buffed away those components. Once they were replaced, the taillights were now World War II spec. Now, to mount the taillights to the tank, I went ahead and also replaced the LEDs. The LEDs, which are found on the stock Heng Long unit, are very small in size. The 3D printed versions are designed to fit an entire normal-sized LED inside. So the LEDs were replaced with two red LEDs of normal size, which were then mounted to the top deck. The 3D printed taillights are highly recommended, and that they actually are very nice in that they have the right and left hand light detailing. If you notice, this version here on the right hand side of the tank is blacked out as per the real units. Now, to mount the LEDs to the top deck, you simply drill 2 small holes into the top deck with a Dremel, and with the LED leads, you use them as a plug to install the component. Now, on the real Sherman tank, the taillights have a small little neck base which emerges from the top deck, which mounts to the rear portion of the taillight, and this component here is both for mounting the light to the tank as well as a conduit for the actual terminals for the lights. Now, in this small scale, what I went ahead and did was, to replicate that, I simply took some plastruct strip and mounted it directly between the 2 terminals. What this does is that this facilitates the missing detailing for the taillight, in that, as you can see, it looks like it has its correct base. And with this small scale, the terminals just kind of blend in with it and looks like an integral part of the original casting. This is also highly recommended to do, as if you do not have this component, your taillight is simply going to be held in place by 2 little thin little rods, which can hurt the look of the model. Moving away from the taillights takes us to the air intake vents, which are also used for the track grouger storage areas. The M4 does have these air intake vents present on the rear deck. Now, this is not found on the A3, and so these components needed to have been acquired or scratch built. For the components you see here, I actually acquired them from Shapeways. Shapeways versions are nicely done and come in a set which includes not only the intakes as well as the grab handles, as well as the Siren. What's also a very nice feature of the Shapeways runner is that it gives you enough components for actually 2 builds. In addition to that, you actually have 2 styles of Sirens, the early war pattern and a late war pattern, which is all nice to have and keep handy for any other build that might just turn up. Now, as nice as these parts are, one component that could have been a little bit better and needed to have been modified was that of the actual air intake. The components you see here are solid 3D print. They're not hollow. And the grill work you see on here, even though it's nice in pattern, is just face value. To improve the component, what I went ahead and did was I hollowed out the solid unit, and I added a replacement grill with that of photo etch grill. I also went ahead and added the center fastener detailing, which can be seen in the thumbnails which are posted around the corner of this video. By doing that, greatly helps increase the accuracy as well as the overall quality of the piece. The components themselves, though, do give a very good start for this procedure, and again, this component here in this whole runner is highly recommended. Moving on from the intake also takes us to the lift ring, and the lift rings, again, are the 3D printed versions, which have the correct profile and shape to them, along with the appropriate weld beads. Directly behind the intake is that of the tow cable clamp. Tow cable clamp you see here is the rest one from ECA. Moving on from that portion of the model takes us to the fuel caps. The filler caps you see here are all the ECA resin units, and the molded ones were simply deleted in place. Here you can also see one of the ECA tow cable mounting cleats. In addition to all these details, the tank's upper hull welds were also re-added with that of sculpted epoxy. Moving on also takes us to the EastCoastArmory.com fire extinguisher, and the fire extinguisher handles have been painted in red, which is standard on all of my builds. On the reverse side takes us to the Pioneer tools. All of the tools you see here are the Heng Long versions, and were simply just painted and weathered and mounted to the model. Now, one thing that was interesting was that on the rear portion here, the Heng Long wrench and sledgehammer are literally the exact same dimensions and error and spec with the Tamiya units. So they simply just mounted directly to the Tamiya component with no mods necessary. Now, moving towards this filler cap here, this filler cap here is actually special. To refill the tank's smoke system, that's facilitated with this filler. In order to do that, this filler is designed to be removed, which underneath is a tube which runs directly into the smoke system and allows you to refill it. To refill the system with the help of an X-Acto knife, I simply plop off the filler cap, and there's the refilling system underneath. Once the vehicle is finished with the refilling, the filler cap simply just gets plugged right back in place, and you're ready to proceed with the operation of the tank. Moving our way to the front portion of the model takes us to first the bow hatch area. Just like on all of my builds, I'd like to add the cast texturing, which is found in this portion here, as this unit here in the real tank was one solid cast unit which was dropped in place, and then the welds were added. As for the details on the periscopes, the molded in periscopes were deleted and 3D printed periscope and periscope guards were mounted. These components are highly recommended and are very detailed. However, one side note is that they are very, very, very frail and fragile, so it is something to keep aware of. The grab handles were also added on the bow hatches as well, and the molded in ones were simply swapped out. Moving our way down to the front of the hull takes us to first the transmission cover. Transmission cover is the stock original unit, but was modified. Like I mentioned in the Jumbo video, on the Heng Long Sherman, the rivet strip is actually integrally molded to the top deck, very similar to that of the Vantex 1/6 scale Sherman. The issue with this is that you will always have a seam on the transmission cover where the two halves meet. This is one portion that I fixed on this build as well as on the Jumbo as well, and the way I did it was the same way I did on the Vantex. With the Multi-Master, I went ahead and amputated and separated the rivet strip from the molded deck and permanently affixed it to the transmission cover. Cast texturing was added and thoroughly blended everything in together. This procedure here improves the stock model 1000%, and it's definitely one that I strongly recommend in doing. As you can see, it has the ECA tow cable clamp as well as the ECA travel brake snap point as well. On the fenders, we have here the fender supports, which are fabricated out of sheet metal. This is the same fabrication technique that I use on the 1/6 scale versions, and are basically just a scaled down version of them. On the top portion of the fenders, the 3 fasteners were also added. Moving up from the transmission takes us to the headlights. The headlights are the stock units, and the only addition I added was a little canister, which is found on either side of the brush guards. As for the Siren, like I said before, this is the 3D printed version, and as you can see, is a nice addition and really helps the model pop compared to using the stock original version. Just like with the 3D printed Siren, the front grab handles are also the 3D printed units. Now, right behind the grab handles are the small little clamps, which are used to mount side view mirrors, which are used for highway use. And if you look at my 1/6 scale Sherman tanks, you'll see what those pieces look like once installed. As for the travel lock, I went ahead and added a little eyelet, which is missing on the kit. And moving our way to the bow M1919. The 1919 you see on this model here is not the original kit offering, and this version here is a aftermarket piece from Aber. The Aber unit is all made out of CNC brass and is highly recommended. One modification that I needed to have made to the Aber set, though, is that the Aber set is designed for static use. This being an RC tank, the machine gun does flash. I went ahead and had to modify the end tip and the rear tip of the Aber set in order to mount on in the center the fiber optic. The fiber optic is both being used as a fiber optic, but also is the barrel detailing, which can be seen through the ventilation holes on the 1919. The 1919 jacket as well had to have been modified to fit inside of the Sherman machine gun ball, as the Aber set is very long and some access needs to be removed in order to get the component at the right length.